I am your MC today, and I'm going to do a bit of an intro here for some housekeeping items. Like I mentioned, we are recording this town hall. It will be on the CCJJ Grant Resources website afterwards. So if you have to leave early or there are those that want to join that can't, we're doing this open house style and making it pretty informal. So it'll be available to you afterwards if you want to go back and reference it. This training is a direct result of a poll that we recently give to our grantees. And these topics that we're addressing today are a direct result of the outcome of that poll. So we wanted to let you know that we are hearing you when you say that you need some resources or you need some information. We're giving it to you via this training. So thanks for joining us and thanks for the feedback on that. It's also a way for us to fulfill our mission of partnering with our stakeholders to maximize the success of our programs. And that's why we've pulled in some of the people that we have today. Jordan is one of our grantees at AOC, as well as being a grant professional on top of that. And Scott Scheffler is with NGMA, and that's one of the resources that CCJJ and our staff utilize. And so we're really grateful for their partnership on this. You may have noticed either in the chat or on the screen here that we're going to utilize questions or answer questions via the chat. So if you'll use this format where you capitalize the word question and then type out your question, and if you have a specific question or a question for a specific presenter, type their name like you see down there. That'll help us be able to address any questions that you have. Okay, let me quickly introduce our speakers. We want to spend the bulk of our time on the training and not this introduction. So I'm not going to read their introductions verbatim or their bios verbatim. I am going to highlight some things. If you want to go back and read their full bios, go ahead and do that via the recording when we put it on the website. So like I said, I'm Colette, I'm your MC. I'm a contract grant analyst here at CCJJ. I'm the team lead for the monitoring team. And many of you know me over the years because I've been here about 5 years. And we've recently built more than just me on our monitoring team. So I'm super excited to have my team presenting to you guys so you can get to know them a little bit more. I'm also a member of NGMA with the National Grants Management Association. I'm currently studying to take their Certified Grants Management Specialist test, which is a pretty prestigious thing. And if I pass, I'll be the first in Utah. So that's just a little bit about me, so you know who I am. Jordan is, like I said, with the Administrative Office of the Courts. He, first of all, hails originally from Oregon, and he recently moved here to Utah and took a job with the AOC. And in the past, he's been in the finance department and with the state health authority in Oregon. And throughout his career, he's worked in grants quite often. It's pretty important to him. We asked him to do the presentation he's going to give on the application, because as a grantee, he knows probably better than us how to submit that. And he's excellent at the information he's going to give you guys. So we're super excited to have him. And then Morgan is a team member here at CCJJ. She's our program manager over the JAG and the RSAT programs. We stole her from the city of St. Louis, so sorry for them, but super excited for us at Utah because she's pretty awesome. She had previous grant management experience in the youth at-risk crime prevention grants in the city of St. Louis. And she super advocates for criminal justice here, not only in Utah, but in previous. She really specializes in mental and behavioral health field and trauma-informed care. So we're grateful to have her here presenting with us today. Brett is a graduate of BYU, and we're excited to have him because he has an MPA from BYU, and he not only is he monitoring the JAG and the federal grants, but he is also a driving force in improving the automation here of the monitoring systems at CCJJ to make things easier for our grantees. And then Scott Scheffler, let me just tell you guys, I'm super excited to have Scott when Andrew Goldsmith, who is also on the line. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. He's the president of NGMA. Scott is the vice president of NGMA, and I have been part of trainings with Scott when he's presented both with NGMA and also with Felsman, Tucker, Leifer, and Fidel. That's one of the grant resources that we've utilized in the past to take training, not only from NGMA, but also from FTLF. So super excited to have him. He's an excellent presenter. You guys are going to learn so much. And you can see from his bio here that he counsels federal grant recipients on financial assistance, administrative requirements, and cost reimbursement. He also assists those recipients undergoing government audits and investigations. He assists government contractors with various contracting matters. You guys, he's excellent. And so the presentation he's going to give on understanding your terms and conditions, I want you guys to know you are in good hands. So with that, we're just going to turn the time over to Jordan. He is going to give our first presentation on Show Me the Money, which is understanding the best practices for submitting a grant application.
All right. Well, thank you, Colette, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. I am just delighted to be here and to have received the invitation from Colette and CCJJ to participate and collaborate with you all today. Thanks to our presenters and our attendees. Just personally speaking, I think this really exemplifies the type of collaboration that's required in a lot of this work. So I appreciate CCJJ modeling that for us all today. So as Colette mentioned, I'm going to, over the next about 20 minutes or so, we'll try and save 5 minutes for questions. We are going to be talking about grant applications, and let's see if I can get my screen to, there we go. All right, so we'll start out with just a high-level overview. Clearly, in the time that we have today together, there's just not enough of it to go through all of the program-specific requirements, all of the agency requirements, have an opportunity for dialogue, as well as provide that high-level overview. So my plan is to do that sort of summary overview at the beginning. Then we'll take a look at some specific program requirements. And then we will move on to the agency specific requirements and have about 5 minutes for questions and a dialogue at the end. So let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so crafting a strong application. So what to expect, and then best practices and some tips about what to avoid. And these come directly from program managers working at CCJJ. So you don't have to take my word for it. This represents a group effort and group feedback that these experts have seen over their work with grantees in the field. So let's start with what to expect. So just some basics for those of you who may not be super familiar with the grants application process and what it looks like. For those of you who have worked with grants before, this will seem pretty basic, which is why I've titled this way. So the typical components of a grant application are the intro, right? So this is the basic information about your grant, or rather your agency, the grant amount you're requesting, and then all of that fun kind of minutia that you would think would be easy to locate, but often takes quite a while. So that's the intro pieces. Goals and objectives. So defining what would success look like. Providing goals and objectives typically is in a format of between one goal, and for each goal that you provide, typically 1 to 3 objectives that follow that. And again, those objectives are intended to really drill down and be more specific about how you're going to achieve that goal. One tool that's very helpful when you're drafting goals and objectives is to use the SMART format. So that's an acronym standing for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And I won't go into all of those today because of the time limits, but I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with that, to do a Google search and incorporate that into your technical writing practice. So then, of course, there's the budget and narrative components. So it's very important when you're drafting an application for CCJJ or for any potential grantor that your budget is accompanied by a budget narrative, and it should be clear and concise. So the purpose of the narrative is really to explain how the funds on that particular line item are going to support the overall project. And I've heard from program managers that it's often the case that applicants will leave out components of the budget or the narrative. And it's very easy to do. I think we all understand that. However, it's just a reminder to triple check your work when you're submitting the budgets and the accompanying budget narrative. It's a very important piece of the application. And finally, the last piece is typically the certified assurances, conditions, certifications, requirements, all of the legal stuff that sometimes makes our head spin if you're not familiar with that world. So definitely set aside some time to review those and make sure that you have the resources and the staff at your disposal to, whether that's general counsel or some type of counsel, to review those terms and conditions and assurances before you dive headlong into the work of preparing an application. It's an important first step. All right, so let's back up here a bit. All right, so federal funds are, of course, subject to Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations. Again, if you're from the grant world, you're familiar with this. If you're not, this is 2 CFR Part 200. It's called the Uniform Guidance because it's just that. It's intended to be uniform. It's intended to be a foundational document for guiding federal grants. So recently, the government provided the eCFR, which is the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. I've included the link here, so you can pull this up later. I know you're all just itching to dive into the Code of Federal Regulations. So when you're ready for that, there is an electronic version that is available. I look at that just about every day. It's just the nature of our work. So wanted to remind us of that. And then more to the heart of this presentation today, in addition to with federal grants having to follow the uniform guidance, each program and agency for which you are applying is going to, in all likelihood, of course, have specific guidance and requirements. So the easiest and simplest way to convey where you should find this information is in the original source. Clearly, it's in the solicitation, it's in the RFP, the request for proposal. If the grantor that you're applying to has crafted a good solicitation or RFP, that information will be included there. So you need to make sure that you are scanning that solicitation for those specific requirements and identifying who your point of contact is if you have questions about those in particular. One thing to note with these specific requirements is that they will often modify, so change, any broader general guidance that the agency may have issued previously. So an example of this would be the Department of Justice's financial guide. For the most part, of course, these things do not change or are not modified, but in some instances, particular grants, particular solicitations, funding opportunities will actually make adjustments to what's provided in the more general guidance. And in almost every case, you are going to want to follow the guidance that's in the solicitation if it conflicts or changes or alters in any way the information that is in the general guidance. All right, so we got the basics out of the way. Let's go and dive into, let's start with what to avoid. Let's get the negative stuff out of the way, then we'll move on to best practices. So again, these are coming from our actual program managers who are at CCJJ. So things that they've continuously seen over their work is submitting incomplete budgets, missing or incomplete attachments. And I know for some of us, there's an impulse when we're crafting any kind of application. We want to provide as much information as we can. We want to demonstrate the need. And sometimes in that effort, we'll include more information than is asked for. And something that's really important when you are working with grants and your application is going to be in front of a review committee is they don't have time to pour through all the additional materials that you have provided. So attaching tables, graphs, any kind of other figures when not allowed or asked for in the application really is not going to win you any additional points most of the time. In fact, it might actually frustrate and annoy the individuals who are trying to evaluate your application. So keep that in mind as you're crafting your work. The other, oops, let's go back here. Should be able to move my screen here, and for some reason I can't. Colette, are you able to advance my slide here? I don't know why I can't get it to advance.
I can't because you're controlling my screen, but if you just hit your back forward button, it'll work. Okay, well, my back forward button seemed like it decided to stop there. So let me, yeah, for some reason here, but I have the presentation up on another screen on my computer. So I'll just read that. So the other screen that I was going to share is that another piece that sometimes comes to the fore is insufficient descriptions and detail in the narrative. So make sure that you are providing some solid information there. Insufficient data or evidence to clearly emphasize the need. So sometimes what happens, and I think this is an important point, when you're trying to convince a funder that your project is worthwhile, you know, there's really two essentially basic strategies you can follow. One is to provide an emotional narrative, one that sort of conveys the need through emotions. And in contrast to that is a narrative that uses more objective information. And that objective information is, of course, in the form of research and data. So I wouldn't argue either way that you need to you know, strictly stick with one versus the other. Technical writing typically does fall more into the objective information. So research, data, facts, over the emotional appeals. But, you know, I think a balance is important. So trying to strike that balance, erring on the side of what's more objective here, because you can't guarantee that the review committee is going to see things the same way as you when it comes to that emotional appeal, because it is a subjective statement or subjective understanding on your part. All right, so let me go back now. All right, now let's look at best practices. So when you're crafting your application, utilizing the 3 C's, so being concise, clear, and complete. Again, I know that sounds really simple and a lot of these things are kind of corny, but really that's extremely helpful when you're practicing technical writing in terms of sharpening those skills and your writing overall. Again, segueing into that, substance over style, plain language, really important. Acronyms, you know, it's very hard to read through an application as a reviewer when you're trying to decipher a bunch of acronyms. And really try and put yourself in the place of the reviewer when you are drafting the application. So as you're thinking about it, what would matter to me if I were from this agency and I were a funder? What would matter to me? What would I want to see in this application? Put that in there. I went back out again. All right, there we go. Hey, it worked now. So the other 2 pieces to mention are emphasizing data and outcomes. I've touched on that before earlier. So
one thing I'll note is with respect to emphasizing data and outcomes, clearly describing how success will be measured, I think is going to be increasingly more important with grants management. So the current or maybe slightly previous paradigm with grants management was really heavy on the federal level with compliance. So there was a lot of attention paid to compliance at the expense of outcomes. And there's an article from the Chief Financial Officer's CFO Council last year, which actually describes this process and describes and encourages a move towards a more balanced paradigm, one which focuses on compliance, of course, which is very important, but which also encourages recipients of grant funds to really establish measurable program and project goals, of course, to benefit the overall outcome of the project. So that's one piece of advice. I think that's going to be coming down the pike in terms of where we focus our efforts and energy with grants. So last piece here is just to, as you're drafting the application, I would pull up the RFP or the solicitation on another screen or do a side-by-side and really try and address your narrative pieces, your budget, et cetera, to follow the same structure of the RFP. That way, when it gets to the review committee, it's very easy for them, because they understand that structure that they've devised, to go through line by line and clearly evaluate your proposal. It's an effective strategy. Also, for quality control purposes on your part, to make sure that you're hitting all the right notes. All right, so let's speed along here because we don't have much time, but let's look at some requirements for specific grants at the program level. So quick introduction. So I really like this word. CCJJ has on their website that they support a criminal justice ecosystem in Utah. And I think that's just so well stated. And as you can see, you know, I would say this looks like an ecosystem to me. There are a number of federal funds and state funding that CCJJ supports. And with respect to the state funding and federal funding for that matter too, these are your grant program contacts. I've listed the programs that they administer underneath their names and contact information. So please reach out to them if you have any questions. And let's look at I had 3 examples here in the requirements, but I'm just going to look at one, I think, given the time. So CCJJ covers 17 distinct state and federal grant programs. So that's quite a few. Let's go ahead and look at one, which is the State Task Force Grant Program. So here's an example of some of the specific requirements, and I'd like to point out these are not exhaustive for this particular grant. As you can see, these are specific to this particular work. And so with the State Task Force Grant Program, for example, policies and procedures need to be in place to support this work, particular policies and procedures. CCJJ has provided some examples and some templates on their website. So when you're crafting applications that might have specific requirements, obviously go to the original source, go to the solicitation, go to the CCJJ website, and more than likely they've got your back. They've got the materials there that you're going to need. So always go there first when you need a resource. Agency specific requirements. So most of us are familiar with, I'm sure, these federal agencies. It can get quite complicated between the umbrella of the Department of Justice, the OJP, Office of Justice Programs, and all of the grants and offices rather, and bureaus that they oversee. But here's a few of them, and I've also included just a few state examples, again, not exhaustive at all. In terms of requirements, let's go ahead and look at the Indigent Defense Commission. So the Indigent Defense Commission provides grants And they require that their grants, the applications, touch on the core system principles that they've defined. So when you're drafting an application for the IDC, for example, you're going to need to speak to these specific requirements. And again, these are grant professionals who are administering these funds, so they will include that guidance for you to use as an applicant. So you shouldn't have too much heartburn about that. Ask the questions about where you can find more information on those resources, and they should be able to provide those to you. Key takeaways. So overall, as I mentioned, sharpen your technical writing skills. Even grant professionals who do this day in, day out have to practice this. It's just something that you got to do. And part of that includes doing research, collecting data, focusing on evaluation. As I said, this is, I think, going to be a growing emphasis area in grants management as a field. So outcomes really do matter. Sometimes they're an afterthought. I think that's going to change. So the solicitation as the original source is your best source. Always go back to that. Remember that any special provisions that modify general guidance in the solicitation, you should follow those over the general guidance that the agency may have provided. And just finally, 2 CFR Part 200 uniform guidance. It's not very exciting reading, but it's tremendously important. So make sure you keep that in your back pocket and make sure you're familiar at least with where to find the information that you need. So I've taken us about a minute over time. So unfortunately, I don't believe we'll have time for questions right now, but I will, of course, remain on the presentation, and I'm happy to follow up with any questions after our time together today. So thank you, Colette, and thank you all for listening. And I think I will turn it back to you, Colette. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate that. We are just going to keep moving on. So our next presenter is going to be Morgan Williams, and she is going to talk about unallowable versus allowable expenses and how you tell which is which. Okay, Morgan, let me know if you can have trouble not controlling my screen.
Okay, I think I requested it. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. All right, great. So as Colette mentioned, my name is Morgan Williams. I am a program manager here at CCJJ, and I manage the JAG, RSAT, the beer tax program, and I also monitor the Indigent Defense Commission grants, both federal and state. So I do both. And so I felt it was important to do this topic because we get a lot of questions about understanding allowable versus unallowable costs. And as a program manager and as a monitor, I see both sides of it, and I see that how confusing it can be sometimes. So in the survey that was recently taken after our last town hall, some surveyors mentioned that sometimes the unallowable versus the allowable costs can be pretty confusing. So we're going to talk today a little bit about that and the resources that we can provide for you as program managers and as monitors, and then also how we find our information. So we're just going to go right in. So you can start out by asking yourself, I have an expense that I'm not sure is allowed within my grant. What do I do? Who do I contact? What are my resources that are available? And how do I go from there? So the next steps would be to always, just overall, you can always ask your program manager, you can always ask your grant monitor. We are here to help you. We are here to be your resource, but also we're going to provide some other details and places to look. So as Jordan mentioned, the application process, there is a time where you can reach out to the program manager on the solicitation. There will always be a point of contact. And so we want to be able to answer a question even before you've officially applied. We want to help you make this program successful and help you make sure that this grant is reviewed well. So ask the program manager during your application process. And then also ask yourself, does this expense meet the requirements of the program? And is this expense necessary for the program to be successful? Just as you want funding, we want your program to be as successful and great as you want it to be. So we want to help you be able to do that. Next, you can look in your signed and approved grant budget, and we'll see how well this goes. I'm going to start with a poll question. So let's see. The poll question, feel free to answer. I have office supplies in my grant budget. Can I purchase a laptop? Yes, laptops are considered office supplies. No, talk to your program manager and ask if this is allowable within my grant. C, I'm going to buy it now and ask questions later. I see we have some jokesters. All right, it looks like we've got some answers here. So the correct answer is no. Talk to your program manager and ask if the laptop is allowable within my grant. So there are levels to this. So no, laptops are not considered office supplies. And sometimes, depending on the threshold of the expense of the laptop, how expensive it is, it can be, depending on the program, it can be categorized in equipment or in supplies. So you really need to speak to your program manager about that if you want to buy a laptop and you want to make sure that it's even allowable within the grant itself. So some grants have terms and conditions that may not allow you to have that in the first place, but then also depending on the threshold of the expense, it may be deemed as equipment or as supplies. And I'm going to ask questions now. I'm going to buy it now and ask questions later. Let's not do that. It is, something funny to say, but it's, it just creates a little bit more work for everyone in the process. And we want to make sure that you get what you need in your program. So once again, just reach out to your program manager and we can help you with that. So thanks for participating in that. And then another resource provided for you are your grant terms and conditions. So every year, CCJJ is required to update our grant terms and conditions. And this summer this summer we did that. And this is an example straight out of most of our most up-to-date grant. And this is number 7. You can probably find this in your grant terms and conditions. This is expenses not allowable. Project funds may not be expended for items that are not a part of the approved budget or separately approved by CCJJ. They also may not be used for the purchase of land or construction projects. And if the proposed cumulative change is greater than 10% of the total award amount. This needs to be written with prior approval. I also want to note that sometimes CCJJ will require prior approval just as much as the federal government requires us to have prior approval for expenses. So it may take some time on an expense to get back to, because not only do we have to approve, but then our either BJA has to approve it or Office of Justice Programs has to approve it. Someone maybe higher even than CCJJ will need to approve that expense. Let's see. So then we have the Department of Justice Financial Guide. CCJJ, along with the Code of Federal Regulations, uses this as a guide, and we try to mirror all of our grants to the DOJ Financial Guide and be in compliance with that. So here's a little excerpt from that. And this goes over unallowable costs. This is page 114 of the DOJ Financial Guide. And this kind of goes over most parts of unallowable costs. And you can see that state and local taxes are unallowable. And and food, entertainment, passports, tips, bar charges, and membership fees whose primary activity is lobbying are also unallowable. With state and local taxes, we see this pretty often. We see this in reimbursement requests in our GMS system, our grants management system. We see that sometimes with a piece of equipment, there's been taxes charged, and that's okay. It doesn't reflect badly on you. It doesn't. We catch it, and we'll have to go back to you. We'll have to have either the program manager or you unsign you as the grantee unsign the FSR. But we do catch it. We try to understand that, you know, sometimes not everybody knows that you, as a government organization or as a nonprofit, you're a tax exempt agency. And so at the vendor level, you can tell them, I'm tax exempt, and show them your tax exempt certificate, and not be charged state or local taxes for that expense. And so it just kind of, it may delay a reimbursement because we have so many steps to take to get that rectified and working to be able to reimburse your grant. And then another unallowable cost, which we sometimes see, are costs that incurred either before the start of the project period or after the expiration of the project. So sometimes we see examples of someone a year ago had this really big expense that happened before the grant was signed, before the grant even started. And it is not only it's my responsibility as a program manager to tell you that, to tell you when your grant starts. So the costs before or after the grant has started or ended are not allowable. And so I like to reach out to my grantees and tell them, hey, your grant is ready to go. Feel free to start your programming. Excited to be working with you. And that's kind of when you can know that you're good to go. You can start your programming. You can start spending those dollars. All right. So who do I contact? This is probably self-explanatory. You can always ask your program manager or your grant monitor. There are 3 grant monitors, and there's a lot of program managers at CCJJ. So you will always be able to reach out to one of us and ask if this expense is allowable or of any resources that you may not already have, and we are able to help you with that. All right, so I don't know if anyone else is the Learning Channel fan, but they said yes to the expense, like they said yes to the dress. Grant monitor and program manager said that my expense was allowed. What do I do next? So your next step would be to talk to your program manager about a grant budget change. Our friend Brett has automated a lot of our processes and has worked really hard on automating our most recent grant budget request form. And so depending if you're a JAG recipient or maybe a state recipient, you may be able to use our link. It's really convenient. We'll send you the link to the grant budget change, and then you fill it out, and then it goes back to the program manager. We approve or send it back for edit, and then it'll just send a copy of the approved grant budget change right to your email to file away. So it is really awesome. And so if you have a grant budget change, I would, or you are requesting a grant budget change, talk to your program manager. Another thing to consider when going to ask for a grant budget change is that we don't always have, it's very rare to have extra money floating around where we can be like, oh yeah, you have an extra expense, here's some extra money. We can't do that. That requires approvals that we may not always be able to get for you. So you may have to work with your program manager. If you have travel changes, your flight was canceled, and we just experienced, last year, all of the conferences and meetings were canceled and put virtual, or maybe even just canceled itself. So you may have leeway in your budget to work with a grant budget change. And say you want to buy that laptop, we can figure out ways where it doesn't impact your programming, or we can change around your budget. And your program manager is always happy to work with you on that. And I'll say it again, we just want your programs to be successful, and we want compliance on both sides. So we are here to help you. We're here to help you with your budget changes and any questions that you may have about that. So we're going to do another poll question. This is more of a pop quiz. Sorry to quiz you, but let's see. I expect everyone to get A's on this one. So my agency is tax exempt. We purchased equipment and submitted the expenses for reimbursement, which includes taxes. CCJJ can reimburse for the taxes incurred. We'll just give a couple more seconds. All right, so the question is false. CCJJ cannot reimburse you for your taxes. If you are a tax exempt agency, a government agency, or a nonprofit, and you have that tax exempt certificate, you can always either go back to the vendor, say this already happened and you already been charged taxes. It's not too late. You can go back to the vendor and ask them to remove those taxes for you, but CCJJ cannot reimburse for those. And that's part of our guidance. That's part of the uniform guidance that we have to follow. So let's see. Thanks for participating in those polls. It really gets people just more involved. And let's see. All right. So now we're going to go into our grants management system, where your budget is, and you can also find your budget in your grant application, but the grant management system is also a good resource for you. What do I do when I accidentally submit an unallowable cost? Say it's in your invoice and you didn't really realize it. Maybe it's something that was just overlooked and missed, and that's okay. So, and then you've already signed it. Maybe your program manager has signed it. Maybe the monitor is monitoring it, and you may be thinking it's too late. Don't worry, it's not too late. The program manager or the monitor might already find it and might be well aware, and maybe already contacted you. So depending on who has signed the GMS report, that you can either go in and remove the cost, the program manager can help, and the monitor can let you know. So it's never too late. If something comes up and happens, just reach out to one of those two people and they can help you with that. It is best to catch it before. So maybe later on, after maybe even it was a year ago, and according to your grant terms and conditions, you have to keep all your records for a certain number of years. So maybe 3 years down the line, it's best that we catch it sooner rather than later. So 3 years down the line, you're not paying back something from 3 years ago and different budgets from 3 years ago. So your grant budget in GMS will reflect the correct amounts. And something I need to tell you that I'm sure you're well aware, if you have multiple grants, not all grants management systems will look like this. This is just specific to CCJJ and the one that we use. So here you can see that there's certain budget categories laid out for you. And then down here on the table will be your overall budget. And GMS allows, I believe it's 10% and 10% more of what is laid out here. So say you have $35,000 of personnel and you go to put in a $45,000 expense, it's probably not going to allow that. So just make sure that you follow this grant budget that's already outlined for you, and you're good to go on that one. If you have any questions about GMS, you can always reach out to the program manager or the monitor, and they can absolutely help you. And we understand sometimes there's glitches. And so just if there's any issues, let us know. And then some other unallowable expenses that we've sometimes seen in the past and we continue to see, and it's okay. We just want to give you all this information and these resources for you so you can, so for your information. And so when it comes down to applying or during your grant budget, you can't, or during, you know, a change of plans, you can really figure if this is allowed or not. So we cannot pay for the cost in applying for the grant. We can't pay for the computer that typed the grant. We can't pay for the personnel salary of the person applying for the grant. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot pay for the expenses prior to the date of the contract. Any lobbying or advocacy for legislative or administrative reform, we cannot pay for, and the purchase of land. And lastly, membership fees for country club, social dining club, and cost of membership in organizations whose primary purpose is lobbying. That is straight from the Code of Federal Regulations that we follow. We cannot pay for that. Now, Colette and I talked about this. We can pay for other membership fees. We can pay for grant management professional organizations. If that's what you want to pay, if that's what you want in your grant budget, that is allowable as long as it is not part of a social dining club or a membership organization whose primary purpose is lobbying. So I just want to leave you with some key takeaways, and feel free to ask any questions that you may have. And so some key takeaways I want to leave you with is that overall, CCJJ is here to help you. We want your program to be successful. We want you to feel comfortable bringing new ideas and change to your program, because we know that plans change. You know that plans change, and we've all experienced what's going on in our world. So we want to be able to help you. And the best way we can do that is to provide you these resources and provide you our contact information and these guidance, these guides to really be able to show you that we're here to help you. And you know, also that program managers and monitors, is even that this is our job, we're not always going to have 100% of the answers. We're even stumped sometimes, and we have to go to each other and collaborate and ask, you know, have you had this situation before? Have you ever paid for something like this? And so we utilize each other. We also reach out to other members in our grants management community and rely on each other and our resources. And that's just, you know, how it kind of works in the grant world. Not everything is black and white. So yeah, so if you have any questions, please let me know. I hope this was helpful for you in understanding allowable versus unallowable expenses. And I guess the major takeaway would be to contact your program manager, contact your monitor. We try really hard to be as responsive as possible. And you can reach us by phone or email, and we will just guide you in the right direction. So please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Morgan, for that. If nobody has any questions, we will just go ahead and proceed to our break. At this time, you guys are, let me get to this. Hang on just a minute here. Get to the right place here. Here we go. So we have this break set up to where if you guys want, you can run and get a drink, run to the restroom. Feel free to chat with each other or any of the presenters in the chat. You can also ask me questions. So one of the things that we that was on that poll that we ask our grantees is, did you want more resources for managing your grants? And that was one of the kind of key results from that, is that you guys wanted more resources. And so this training is part of that, and our partnership with both AOC and NGMA is part of that as well, because you may not realize there are a lot of resources out there. I'm actually going to do a poll, and this might help you guys. Hang on just a minute. Okay, go ahead and take that poll. I'm curious to see what your answers are going to be. I'm hoping that you all realize how many resources you have available to you, or maybe you'll learn of some that you don't necessarily know about right now. I'll give it just a few more seconds here for you guys to answer that. So as far as what resources are available to you as subgrantees, the answer is all of the above. Not only do we have resources on our grant resources page of our website, the entire CCJJ website is hopefully a resource to you. If there's anything that you find that is lacking on there or that you want more, please let us know and we will do our best to get that on there. In fact, we are currently working on updating the grant resources page to give you guys more links and access to some of these resources. We're going to link to NGMA's website, to Scott's organization, FTLF's website. We're going to link to a couple of other grant management resources or websites that are out there that are professional organizations that can help you. Of course, the technical assistance and training from CCJJ staff, that's what this training is all about. We're here to help you. We really do take that seriously, that we're partners with our stakeholders to maximize the success of our programs. And this is all part of that. The DOJ financial guide, the GMBOT guide, which you guys may or may not have heard of, but NGMA, and this is one of the reasons why I really like NGMA and have both chose to be a member and to pursue the CGMS certification, is that this GMBOT guide, that stands for Grants Management Book of Knowledge. It's kind of like a Bible. Whenever I have a question about something, just like Morgan was saying, if we're questioning things, that's one of the resources we can go to, is go flip through the pages and say, okay, what does the GMBOT guide say about that? In fact, we just did that like yesterday or the day before. You guys may not realize it, but everybody that is presenting today is an NGMA member. I'm a member, Morgan's a member. There are other grant professional organizations out there that you can become members of that are helpful, and I've listed some of those in there. So if you have any questions for me about that, I will put out there that for legal reasons, any discussion regarding NGMA, the membership, CGMS certification, it does not constitute or imply an endorsement by CCJJ. These are my views, having been a member for several years now, on the benefits that I have seen. So the views and opinions that are expressed in this town hall or any of the accompanying documentation are solely mine or the respective speakers, and don't necessarily reflect those of CCJJ or the state of Utah. I'm also going to put out there, here's another resource for you. NGMA has a blog that's called the Connect blog. And let me put this in the chat. I am actually working with them right now and are writing articles for them that hopefully will be a resource to you guys. So in the chat, I just dropped a link to the first article that I wrote, and I'm going to do a trilogy of these about partnering with our stakeholders and what that means and how that helps us maximize the success of our programs. So with that, I will hush. You guys have 10 minutes that you want, or that you can do whatever you want. I encourage you to chat in with each other. Feel free to ask me any questions. Maybe Morgan or any of the other presenters, if you guys have questions for me or want to share your experiences as NGMA members or other organizations that you know about, please do so.
I'll give a plug to a particular federal agency that, for whatever reason, has the best guidance on indirect cost rate agreements and cost allocation. Because people ask all the time, where can I get more info on that? And there's one particular federal agency that's really got its act together, and this is the Department of Labor. So sorry, DOJ, but the Department of Labor really has great information that's useful government-wide. And so there's one thing called the Indirect Cost Rate Determination Guide that is the best thing out there on negotiating indirect rates and understanding how they work. And then DOL, about a decade ago, wrote a guidebook for its what used to be the Workforce Investment Act program, now it's WIOA, for their one-stop centers. And part 2, financial management, the financial management guide for those one-stop centers has a great section on cost allocation when you're direct allocating. So these issues come up all the time from grantees, and as far as publicly available, federally produced resources, there's a lot of bad stuff. This is really good stuff. So the one-stop guide, part 2 for the Workforce Investment Act grantees from 2012, I think, or 2011, and then DOJ's indirect cost rate determination guide. We actually use, I co-teach the law school class on federal grants at GW, and we use when we talk about indirect rates, we use the indirect cost rate determination guide from DOL.
Hey, Scott, do you have a link to that you could drop in the chat for everybody?
Let me find a link for each.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Because that's another thing, that any of these resources that anybody has, please drop links into the chat for each other, because, you know, not only does CCJJ want to partner with all our stakeholders, we want you to be able to partner with each other to help each other be successful in your program. So if anybody knows of any resources, please drop them in the chat. And Andrew, I don't want to put you on the spot, but Andrew Goldschmidt's here. And earlier I misspoke and said that he was the president. He's the executive director. I don't know if you want to say anything. You don't have to if you don't want to, because I'm putting you on the spot.
Hey, Colette and everybody. I think my video is, oh, there we go. My video is on now. I was trying to turn my video off. I think it was toggled off. So, hey, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Colette, for organizing. Thank you, Jordan, Brett, Morgan, others, you know, for assisting here. We really appreciate it. We are available to answer any questions. If you want to chat, I'm here to monitor it. Scott's our VP, and but of course he's a SME. He's a subject matter expert. I consider, you know, him representing us very well. But if you have any questions in the chat, we're certainly glad to answer them. But ngma.org, if you go there, it's pretty self-explanatory, pretty easy to navigate. Lots of tabs that explain themselves, whether it be the JAMBOK Grants Management Body of Knowledge Guide or the training. Or we have, you know, the Grants Management Virtual Learning every month, webinars that are attended by quite a few hundred folks. So those that aren't involved, we certainly hope you'll consider getting involved with NGMA and joining and being a part of us. So thank you. With that, I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Andrew. So Holly, you just put something in the chat, and if it's all right with you, I'm going to read it. I don't see you on the list of people there, so maybe you can just type in the chat whether it's okay if I share what you just wrote. Okay, so what she says is, she says, I'd love to talk about maybe starting an NGMA chapter in Utah or possibly partnering with another state. Our closest chapter is in Colorado, but that's fairly far. So I don't know, maybe Andrew and or Scott, you guys can answer this. I don't know like how to do that, or like how many we have to have if we want to start that. You want to address that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for that level of interest. We certainly can have an ongoing conversation about it. There's basically a form where a certain amount of people have to attest that they want to start the chapter. I think it's 25, if I'm not mistaken. They have to actually sign the petition, to form the chapter, or that they're fully in support, the intend and to be there from the beginning to help organize and so on. I will admit we're, as many of us, were a little staff capacity strapped at the moment. So I don't want to create an expectation of immediacy, but we can certainly start that conversation and see where it goes, with the folks that are here. But it sounds like a great idea. The participation today is great. I see 48 folks here, so certainly seems like it would be a possibility, and we can certainly start that conversation and go from here.
So question on that, do they have to be members to join a chapter?
Yes, the
Okay.
official chapters of our organization, and so the members get automatic access to chapters. Now you could attend a meeting. We've done some trials, free trials, so to speak, where we can allow some folks to attend another meeting. We're more than happy to do that if you're interested to an upcoming meeting, so you can get a experience. You just have to coordinate that with the other chapter, so they're aware of it. But
Okay.
there's lots we can discuss about go forward and considerations to
Okay.
organize, so to speak.
Yeah, maybe we'll, so everybody here probably doesn't realize that there's only 8 NGMA members in the entire state of Utah. And of those 8, 5 are CCJJ related. We have 3 here at CCJJ. We have 2 down at UOVC. I think our IDC people is considering it. And then we have a couple of UTA people, and I can't remember if they're on the call or not. They were invited to this. So if you're from UTA, type in the chat, the UTA people. That way we can give you a shout out, because it's exciting to have other NGMA members. When I signed up, there was only, 1 or 2 people, and I was never able to get a hold of them. So I don't even know if they were like super active. So Holly, is it you that's from UTA? Yes, she is. Okay, so Holly, the one that asked about that, is from UTA. She's one of our other members. So thanks for joining us. Super excited to have you guys here. So Morgan dropped in a link to the DOJ financial guide. Thanks for doing that, Morgan. Appreciate that. That's one of the resources besides the GMBOT guide and the ECFR, or the ECFR and part 200 of the uniform guidance is the same thing as when I'm talking about it. That's what I call. Those are our Bibles when it comes to grants management. And even though that those tend to be considered federal resources, just so everybody knows, when we administer our grant programs, regardless of whether it's state funding or federal funding, we follow that guidance. And I think Morgan mentioned earlier that we mirror our processes as closely as possible to the federal processes. Now, of course, if there's specific state guidance for state funded programs, we follow that. But in absence of that, and going back to Jordan's presentation when he was talking about the state task force, there is not specific state guidance on confidential informant funds, so we automatically default to the federal level guidance on confidential informant funds. So any of the policies and procedures that we follow really closely mirror what the feds do with their confidential informant funds. Okay, we only have about 1 minute before we move on, and Brett is going to talk about, well, now I forgot what Brett's presentation. It's about monitoring. We talked about this in our last town hall, kind of a little bit more in depth, and we had less people there. So this is going to be kind of maybe a higher level of what to expect, but we want you to realize that, and going along with this comic that goes with to the topic of the newsletter article that I wrote for NGMA, is I always jokingly tell our grantees when we go out to visit them that it's our job to keep them off the 6 o'clock news. And so Brett's going to kind of address that, like, we're not auditors. We are here to be your friend. We're here to help you maximize the success of your programs. So Brett, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, Colette, if you'll just pull up the presentation.
Yep. Can you see it? Oh, not yet. Hang on. Let me get with it. There we go. Now you should be able to see it.
All right. All right. Let's see. I've requested the control, Colette. Can you prove that?
It should be automatic, Brett. You should be able to go ahead and do it.
Okay, there we go. All right, so with CCJJ monitoring, as everybody's been mentioning in previous presentations, our goal really is to help you so that you can be successful. And so that should auditors show up looking into everything, you're squared away and you can be confident that you're not going to have any significant findings against you with that. And to that end, we have 3 different methods of monitoring. The first is FSRs, and then we also have desk reviews and site visits. The FSRs, go ahead and dive into those real quick. This is basically just you requesting reimbursement for your expenditures. Your role in that is basically just to fill out the expenditures page in the GMS, submit a progress report, and submit at least a ledger as documentation of your spending. If Kaylee is your program manager, your process will be just a little bit different. She has few enough programs that she can manage, being kind of a middle person on that. But no matter what, then the CCJJ process is basically that the program manager reviews everything to make sure that it appears to be in line with your grant. And then a financial monitor will review everything. This is normally where we catch little things like taxes being charged to the grant, or calculations being just a little bit off. And when we find that, we will contact you and the program manager to just fix it real quick. It's not really a big deal. As long as we get that fixed, everything will be fine moving forward. And as Morgan said, that may delay your reimbursement a little bit, but beyond that, it's not much of a big deal. And then after that, we submit that payment to the state financial system, FINET, and we cut you a check. You can check the progress of that in the GMS system based on who has signed off on the FSR. We do these FSR reviews every quarter to make sure that everybody's getting their reimbursements quickly. Our goal with it is to have it completed within 2 days of you submitting it. We're not always perfect at that, but we do our best to get it done really quickly so that you can get your funds quickly and be able to use those. Going from there, desk reviews. This is kind of our second most frequent thing that we do, where we get a little bit deeper than the FSRs. We request a little bit more documentation. So the process on that is we will send you an initiation email. You'll receive that from whoever's monitoring that grant. If it's a federal grant, that'll usually be me. If it's a state grant, it'll usually be Colette. If it's an IDC grant, then Morgan will usually be doing that. Basically, that email will just be informing you that we're going to be doing a desk review, and attached to that email, you will get a survey. The survey is kind of long, and some of the questions seem pretty serious, but don't panic. It's mostly us trying to figure out where you're at so that we can help you be in better compliance and help you understand any issues that may or may not be going on, so that we can fix those before any issues become permanent or get audited by somebody. Again, we are not auditors. We are here to monitor you to make sure that you're in compliance before somebody comes in and brings down the hammer. We're here to help you. So just do your best with the survey. It's to help us help you. And then with that, oftentimes we will get that survey back with only your project manager's signature. We also need the signature of a financial officer on there. And that doesn't necessarily have to be like the financial director or anything, but just somebody who is familiar with the financial side of things to sign off and say that the financial section of that survey is accurate. We will also typically request specific documentation. That'll depend on your grant. If there's equipment or supplies, we may request documentation of the specific purchases, whether that's invoices or serial numbers and things of that nature, to make sure that the purchases actually happened. This is partially for us to be able to be in compliance ourselves with our federal partners, and then partially to be able to make sure that you have on record and we have on record those specific documentations, so that if you get audited, everything works out. We are flexible on timing and deadlines for this. Just communicate with us. As long as you're communicating, we're really flexible about that. I've had some grantees where I initiated the desk review and they were in the middle of some pretty heavy financial processes at the time, and I was able to delay that for a few weeks for them to be able to get that done, and we're happy to do that. And then once we've received that documentation from you, we'll get started on a report. Depending on how busy we are with everything, that may be a quick turnaround, or it may take a little bit of time. But as soon as we've got that report finished, we will submit that to the GMS, and we'll send you a copy and inform your program manager at CCJJ that it's been done. In that report, if we have any findings, we'll let you know, and you'll be able to respond to those via an email or via a form to let us know what you're doing about those, or what corrective actions you're taking, or whether we maybe were wrong in a finding, and we're happy to work with you on those. Attached to the report will also be a risk assessment. With that risk assessment, you'll be either scored as low risk, medium risk, or high risk. Most of our grantees are low risk. And if you are low risk, then these in-depth reviews like desk reviews and site visits will most likely only be happening once every 3 years, unless there is an issue that somebody sees and we want to dive in a little deeper. If you're medium risk or high risk, it can get a little more frequent than that. If you're high risk, we're going to monitor you every year. Certain grants are just automatically high risk, like state task force grants with confidential informant funds. Because of the nature of the confidential informant funds, we just make it high risk so that we can monitor you more frequently and make sure that you're in compliance with how you are tracking those confidential informant funds. Moving on to site visits, you can basically think of this as a desk review plus, because we will do basically the same process. You'll get the same survey that we need you to fill out, but we'll also request to be able to come and visit with you. Sometimes we do this via Zoom, but we also go and actually meet with you on location a lot of times. If we request anything specific to be able to lay eyes on, we need you to be able to have that available for us. If necessary, we do understand that sometimes things are being used in the field at the moment. We can work around with that. But as much as possible, we want to be able to lay eyes on equipment or the CI funds or supplies, et cetera. So that's that. I've got just a couple of quick poll questions. I'm gonna go ahead and launch the first one. So what is CCJJ's most frequent monitoring activity? Single audits, FSR reviews, desk reviews, or site visits? All right, we'll go ahead and wrap that up. So the results, most of you got that right with FSR reviews. We do perform those quarterly to make sure that you're in compliance ahead of time so that we don't encounter any significant financial issues for you. We do desk reviews kind of second most, and then site visits if we feel like there needs to be a little bit more in depth. CCJJ does not perform single audits, but we do sometimes request documentation of single audits that you have had done, depending on how many federal fund dollars your agency receives. The current threshold for that is 750,000. So if that is the case, we will request a copy of your most recent single audit. All right. Second question. How often will CCJJ perform in-depth monitoring activities on low-risk grantees? All right, go ahead and wrap that up. So some of you said annually. If it is high risk, it will be annually, but if it's low risk, it'll actually only be once every 3 years. The quarterly, we only do FSRs on a quarterly basis, and those we don't consider very in-depth because that's just the basic documentation that you're required to submit to request reimbursement. And we just make sure that everything in there lines up. And whenever it rains in Africa, I'm glad we're not doing it that frequently because it would go crazy. And then just one last question. What is the primary purpose of grant monitoring activities? All right. So yeah, it is to serve grantees and the public by partnering with you to ensure compliance. Sometimes it can feel like a little bit of a bureaucratic nightmare. And I get that, especially with the survey, it can feel a little bit intense. But just remember that with that survey or with any of our monitoring activities, we're mostly just trying to help you. So just do your best on that. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask us. We're here to work with you and make sure that everything works out. With that, I'll just go ahead and turn it over.
Thanks, Brett. Appreciate that. I'm just going to add a few things to that as the team lead on the monitoring. That the reason why we do monitoring is not only to help you maximize the success of your programs to fulfill our philosophy, not prophecy, but also because we're required on all of our federal grants, there is a condition in there that requires us to monitor our subgrantees. So we're just fulfilling that duty that we have. Plus, it's just good practice as we're all taxpayers to be good stewards of that public funding. So it's all part of that. Jill asked a question in the chat to me that says, if you're a task force and are deemed high risk due to CI funds, doesn't that make you high risk on all grants? That is a really, really great question, not just for the task force grants, but across the board. So if you are a high risk subgrantee for whatever reason, does it make you a high risk on every single one of your grants? The answer to that is both yes and no. Let me explain that. That it makes you a high risk subgrantee, but depending on the nature of why you are high risk or even medium risk is whether or not that transfers to any decision making across your grants. Like, for example, some of you may not know this, but a lot of the task force will get both asset forfeiture grants, state task force grants, and potentially other federal grants like a JAG grant. So like, let's just say that Jill and her organization are high risk grantees because they have confidential informant funds on a task force grant. but not on their other 2 grants that they have with us. It puts them at high risk category, but it doesn't necessarily put the other grants at high risk. So we would only necessarily do monitoring activities on that specific grant more often. Now, however, if you're another grantee that let's just say that you have multiple grants with CCJJ and you are high risk because you failed to submit your progress reports, or you've had major monitoring findings that whether it's purposeful or inadvertently have had unallowable expenses, and it's high dollar and it's repeat and whatever, that would put you as a high risk category in all of your grants, and we would do more monitoring activities on all your grants at that point. So it's kind of a complex thing when we're talking about why and how often we monitor grants. And if you have any questions as far as why you're a high-risk grantee, normally we will communicate that to you. We try to be very transparent in our activities here when it comes to monitoring, but we are like everybody has said before, we are here to help you. So feel free to reach out to either your program manager or to your grant monitor, any of us, anybody at CCJJ. We are all, ready and willing to help you. That's part of our job. So unless there is no other questions, that I don't see any, I'm just going to turn it over to Scott. Scott, you've got a couple of extra minutes.
Well, thank you, Colette. And so one thing I realized, I'm going to put something in the chat here, which is it's important to cover for 2 reasons. One, I had promised you that I would share these resources, and they're really useful resources. All right.
Are you able to, you might have to ask to take my screen.
I may.
Present.
And it's important. It's good that I have the extra moment. Give me 1 moment. Okay. So I was trying to share the resources that I thought I had already shared with everyone in the chat when you asked me to. So these are really great cost allocation and indirect cost rate related resources. This is an important moment for 2 reasons. 1, these resources are great. And 2, everyone is now well aware of my low level of technical proficiency when it comes to computers. So we'll make our way through the presentation. So thank you, Colette, for having NGMA as a part of this. And thank you for having me as a part of it as a speaker. I appreciate the very kind introduction. To give a sense to everybody, I guess out of my own mouth, I'm a lawyer that practices in federal grants. I work with the law firm. I'm a partner in the law firm Feldsman Tucker Lifer Fidel here in Washington, D.C., and we do a lot of grant work across agencies. I am, as Colette mentioned, let me see if I do this right with Prezi. I'm going to request control. And with NGMA, I'm on the board and presently the vice president, but the real star of NGMA is Andrew, who you already saw. We at NGMA are trying very hard to provide relevant resources all the time, but especially during the pandemic. And so if you have questions about grants, I think I've got it, or grant resources, or you want to be a part of an organization that the members are grant managers and that's what they do and think about all the time, I highly recommend NGMA. I'm involved with it because it's a great organization. So that's my plug. We've plugged it a lot, so I won't plug it anymore. We'll talk substance. I'm going to continue to prove that my level of technical proficiency is low. I think I will be able to advance by clicking. There we go. Prezi is very cool. It looks so much better than just PowerPoint. I just don't drive it as well. So this is the info on NGMA if you want to check it out. I have been tasked with, and I am going to do my earnest best to succeed at, conveying what the terms and conditions of your grants are when you receive your federal grants. And it seems at times, I think, that it's an insurmountable challenge, understanding what it is that all your compliance obligations are. And it actually really does take years of experience to become very fluent in the grants vernacular and to become very comfortable with the various terms and conditions that attach. And I recognize that as you go through that process, you're doing it in an environment that feels fraught with risk, all these unknown unknowns that have financial consequences. One of the things that's really great, I think, for your community is that your pass-through, your state agency that you're working with is trying to provide resources and work with you as partners. I can tell you that is not the same across federal agencies. It is not the same across state agencies across the country. I have seen, well, we're recording this, so I won't tell some of the war stories I might otherwise record, but I have seen state agencies act in not just arbitrary fashion, but I mean, really, really aggressive, almost as though they view themselves as police with respect to the grantees. And so the fact that you have much more of a partnership type relationship, even though, right, the state agency is responsible for monitoring and has to do that monitoring, the fact that it's a collaborative relationship is a really important thing for success of programs. So that's very cool. Now, having said that, to do sort of the terms and conditions of a grant in 25 minutes, we can't talk about every detail. But the reality is, if I try to talk about every detail, you won't remember them. You'll tune out half of them, and the ones that interested you, you'll forget within a week. What's more important, and I think grantees don't always realize this, but what's more important is that there's a fundamental nature to the arrangement, to the legal relationship between a grantee and the government. And this is true. I'm going to speak in terms of vis-a-vis the federal agency, but everything I say is equally true between a subrecipient and the pass-through entity. At least it's equally true to the extent that the pass-through entity, the state agency, mirrors its processes to the federal processes. And as you heard Colette say, and as you heard Morgan say, UCJJ does that. So everything, I'm going to talk in terms of grantee and government, federal government, but this is equally true at the subrecipient level. The fundamental legal relationship between the grantee and the government is really important. And what a lot of grantees don't realize is that in almost every single grant, I say almost because there's always an outlier, but 99% of grants, that relationship is the same. It doesn't matter if it's a Department of Labor grant or a Department of Transportation grant or a Department of Justice grant. It doesn't matter if it's NIH or DoD research. The fundamental legal relationship is always, well, almost always, right, 99% of the time, the same. And the idea is, when we're talking about federal financial assistance, the arrangement that then leads to all the terms and conditions is that the government has decided that rather than do something itself, the federal government, it would rather convey something of value to a non-federal actor, state, local, tribal government, private nonprofit, sometimes for-profits, convey something of value to that entity to facilitate that entity's carrying out this activity that has a public purpose. That's what the government wants to do. And then the recipient, the grantee, the entity that wants to engage in that activity desires to engage in a specific aspect of a broader activity that's authorized under the federal program. These two parties come together and make a deal that is, so long as the grantee, or to the extent that the grantee, engages in certain activities that the government wants during a certain period of time, then the federal agency will reimburse the grantee for certain, not all costs, but certain costs, in fact, it's most costs, of engaging in that activity. When I talk about this, I think this is one of the most important things you can understand about the terms and conditions of your grant, is that most of the legal requirements, in fact, almost all, again, we're in 97 to 99% range of the terms and conditions of your award that have real consequences relate to one of these certains. We regularly are assisting grantees after something has gone wrong. Oftentimes we're helping them essentially fight with the federal government or survive something that they did wrong that's now led to an enforcement action by the federal government. And 97 to 99% of all the things that can go wrong on your grant pertain to one of the certains. The violations are always a violation of one of the certains, whether it's that the funds were used for something other than the approved activities, the funds weren't accounted for in the right periods for when the costs were incurred, or the costs that were incurred didn't comply with the federal, the restrictions of the federal cost principles, which are actually not all that restrictive, even though they feel like it when you're a grant manager. So these three certains, this and that relationship with the federal government, that's what a grant is. It's the federal government saying, or the pass-through entity saying, if you engage in certain activities that are in the first instance, and we're going to get into now what starts to set these parameters, that are in the first instance set by a federal authorizing statute that enables the agency to have the program, and then further set by the funding opportunity announcement, potentially regulations, not every program has regulations that apply to that particular program. We'll talk about the uniform guidance in a minute. And then the notice of funding opportunity or the funding opportunity announcement that the agency issues, right? So broad parameters of certain activities. And then those activities that in response to that framework that has led to the notice of funding opportunity, your grant application that has a narrative, and this is, you heard Jordan speak to this, right? That has a narrative and a budget that fundamentally define the scope of your project, the funded activities, with some wiggle room around the edges, and there's special rules on that I won't get into, but fundamentally defined by your grant application, the narrative and the budget. Those activities are the things that you and the government have agreed are the things that you will do. So when you're thinking terms and conditions, the number one sort of fundamental biggest term or condition, if you will, is what are the things that I'm funded to do? Because the government's not funding me for any and all good things or bad things. It's only funding me for certain things, and those are defined in my grant application. Both, again, I'm being redundant, but both through the narrative and the budget. And then the certain period of time, this can cause some trouble, usually not major trouble, but it can cause some trouble. Most federal awards are funded for a multi-year project period, but actually funded year to year and through incremental funding in increments. So 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, 1 year budget periods, whether it's a 3-year project period or a 5-year project period, typically the actual award will be for 1 year with a soft indication that you'll probably be funded in the next year if you don't screw up, all the way through that 3 or 5 year period before which you have to potentially compete again. Obviously, certain formula grants, et cetera, you don't have to compete for those if you're a local government, state government, local government, or tribal government. But in any case, the costs that you incur in carrying out those activities are costs that have to have been incurred during the budget period to charge them back to the award that you're charging them to. So the awards for a particular budget period, the costs you incur in that budget period that are allowable costs, which we'll talk about in a minute, are the costs that you can then charge back to the grant. So you have agreed activities during an agreed time frame, and that really sets the scope of what you can and can't do. And then layered on top of that, if you will, is the fact that the federal government won't reimburse any and all costs that you incur in carrying out those activities, right? So you may be engaged in the right activity, you may incur a cost that is in furtherance of that activity during that period of time, but nonetheless, the nature of the cost is such that there's a policy restriction that either prohibits you from charging that cost back to that particular award, or prohibits you from charging the entirety of that cost back to that federal award. And what I mean by that is, for example, there are certain policy limitations that simply outright prohibit costs. Entertainment costs are prohibited. Alcohol, at least outside of the healthcare context, is prohibited. Lobbying costs are prohibited. You heard Morgan speak to the fact that taxes are an unallowable cost if you're a tax exempt entity, right? The federal government is saying, look, if you don't have to pay taxes, we expect you to actually take advantage of that benefit and not say, look, because this is federally funded, I'm not really going to manage whether I'm paying taxes. And so when the bill comes in with the sales tax, I just pay it and pass that along to the feds. They want you managing that at your level. So there are certain, as a policy matter, certain costs that simply aren't allowable costs. And then there's other costs where they're technically allowable, but the government might only reimburse you a portion. Less than arm's length rental transactions is the quintessential example. If you're leasing from a party with which you have a close relationship, the ability to substantially control, or they have the ability to substantially control you, then that that rental cost is capped. You can pay whatever you want, but the actual rental cost that you charge to your federal awards is capped at ownership costs. And so you can see why these policy limitations exist. They're all embedded in the cost principles. Most routine business expenses are allowable, but certainly if you're a grant manager and you're thinking, what are the terms and conditions that apply to this relationship? fundamental requirements that you must develop a familiarity with are the cost principles. Unallowable costs are, of course, always the big fear as you're managing your award. And the cost principles do have the unknown unknowns if you don't actually read them. And so it is a worthwhile endeavor. So you see if I've done this right. Oh, there we go. I'm going to try to drive poorly in one respect or another on each and every slide. So in terms of where do the terms and conditions then, when we think of all the statutory and regulatory requirements? So I just talked big picture, and that's the main thing to remember, right? Certain activities during a certain period of time, the federal government will reimburse certain costs. But when we start to then drill down into more of the nitty gritty of the terms and conditions, and what I'm saying is true regardless of your funding source. When we start to drill down into the nitty gritty, well, where do the rules come from? Well, fundamentally, the rules will come from the authorizing act for the program. There's two constitutional limitations on federal grants, or I should say there's one constitutional authority and one constitutional limitation that are important in understanding the framework within which federal agencies operate. So the first is that under the spending clause, at least since two cases in 1937, under the spending clause, Congress, if you actually read the Constitution and read the spending clause, you'll see that a portion of Article 1, Clause 8 is that Congress has the authority to essentially tax and spend for the general welfare and for the defense of the nation. And since 1937, that language has been interpreted very broadly by the Supreme Court, essentially authorizing Congress to establish any grant program that it wants to. If it is using general federal revenues for the purposes of creating a program where it's making available to a non-federal entity something that has value for purposes of carrying out a public purpose, Congress's authority is virtually unlimited. There are some limitations around the edges. For example, terms and conditions on a grant can't directly violate the grantee's constitutional rights, but there aren't many cases where that comes up. Some religion areas, freedom of speech areas where the government's trying to make a grantee adopt a particular message outside the scope of their program. But by and large, Congress can do what it wants here. There's very few limitations. The other consideration for federal agencies is that absent statutory authority, so for an executive branch agency to take something that belongs to the federal government that has value and convey it to a non-federal party, the agency itself, the executive agency, does not have inherent authority to do that. The only way the executive agency can do so is if Congress says it's allowed to do so. So each and every grant program has an authorizing statute. Some are very long and detailed, some are very brief, only one sentence buried in the US Code. Oftentimes for research, for example, it'll just be a brief sentence in the authorizing act for NIH that says it can make grants. But there are many programs where the authorizing statute is actually really quite long, almost reads like regulations. The Head Start program, the AmeriCorps program, I mentioned WIOA, the WIOA program, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and DOL. And then there are certainly plenty of programs where the authorizing act is, Ryan White's super long, Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, where the authorizing act is maybe 8 sections of the US Code, so it provides some parameters, but it's not particularly burdensome to work your way through. A great example of that is the Burn JAG program, one with which I suspect many of you are familiar. But always, in each and every case, there will be an authorizing statute, because without that, the agency can't make the grants in the first place. Then the way that, at least in theory, Schoolhouse Rock style, the federal government works is that year to year to year to year, you'll have an appropriation. And that's still basically true, though we now live in a world where there's a lot of continuing resolutions, et cetera, but those are a form of appropriation. And the appropriation is Congress granting executive agencies the authority to expend funds from the Treasury. So we think of it as funding stuff. Technically, the appropriation is providing authority to a particular executive agency to spend money that's in the Treasury. The appropriations, Congress will often, so the authorizing acts for the programs are typically fairly stable. They aren't changed very often. Some programs are reauthorized, say every 5 years, every 10 years, et cetera. And then the authorizing act may change. But by and large, the authorizing statutes for programs tend to be fairly stable. But the appropriations happen year over year over year over year. And so Congress will play with the rules through the appropriation. They will put in, so for example, a very common limitation for HHS grants, and I know you're not HHS grant recipients, but a common limitation in HHS grants is a salary cap, that grantees can't use federal grant dollars to pay their employees more than whatever the current executive level 2 rate is for federal employees. So that's an example of an additional limitation. Again, this is an HHS example that can be applied to your grant funds, but it doesn't come from the authorizing act. It does come from Congress, but it's applied year over year through the annual appropriation. There's language in the bill, in the act, that limits the amount that the grantees can pay. So when you're thinking, well, where do I find my terms and conditions? You got your authorizing statute. And then in addition to that, you have the Appropriations Act that's issued every year. I'm going to talk about how you go about reading this stuff without thinking that you essentially need to be a lawyer and go find the statute in some database somewhere. There's other public policy limitations that can be applied. And then on top of that, through the Appropriations Act, and then on top of your authorizing act and your annual appropriation, there are some other cross-cutting statutes that'll impact the work that you do. I will say that most of the cross-cutting statutes you don't have to worry too much about because they're then captured again in the Uniform Guidance, which we'll be talking about. But statutes like the Single Audit Act, that's really covered by Subpart F of the Uniform Guidance. Bird Anti-Lobbying Amendment, that's addressed typically in funding opportunity announcements. It's addressed, I believe, again in the Uniform Guidance. It certainly is in the terms and conditions you have to insert in contracts. The whistleblower protection example that I have here is not actually covered in the Uniform Guidance, but it's pretty well known. But so there are some cross-cutting statutes, but by and large, those aren't driving your terms and conditions on your individual federal award. And then where a lot of the action happens in the grant context is at the regulatory level. So there is a cornerstone set of regulations that I suspect you are mostly familiar with, we all call it the Uniform Guidance, the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. One of my pet peeves is that this is often described as a new regulation, and that's technically true. It was late 2014 when the Uniform Guidance was promulgated. But the reality is that the rules that are set forth in 2 CFR Part 200, or if you're an HHS 45 CFR Part 75, those rules have existed for decades, really 40 to 50 years, depending on what type of entity you are, what type of grantee entity you are. So while the Uniform Guidance itself is new, this cornerstone or archstone regulation is setting forth rules that have been the key cornerstone rules in the system for decades. They're so key to the system that even when Congress legislates, creates new programs, changes programs, and does things like establish match requirements, cost share requirements, apply administrative cost caps, set forth beneficiary eligibility. The concepts that Congress has in mind and the people who are writing these statutes have in mind are the concepts that are embodied in the Uniform Guidance, and before that through the OMB circulars that preceded the Uniform Guidance. So your cornerstone, even though statutes trump regulations, the key cornerstone terms and conditions governing document that you really need to be familiar with is the Uniform Guidance. And there's two, as a grantee, two really main sections. And I'll say sort of a third, less important, but still important section, but most of you won't deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So the key main section in terms of administering your award is the administrative requirements, subpart D of the Uniform Guidance, which is the 200.300 series of the regs, and then the cost principles, which is subpart E, and that's the 200.400 series of the regs. I would say also very important, but you probably won't deal with it day to day, is subpart F, which is your audit obligations. Everything before, and I guess I should say subpart A as well, because it's the definitions, and it is an American tradition to legislate through definitions. It's very commonplace for a lot of the key requirements to actually be embedded in a definition. So you need to be familiar with subpart A as well. but it's this uniform guidance. When you're thinking, well, what are the terms and conditions of my award? It is critical to start with a baseline framework and understanding of the uniform guidance. That's your starting point. If you're new to grants, that's your starting point. Everyone in your office who is not new to grants will tell you exactly the same thing. And then some grant programs will have grant-specific regulations. Program-specific regulations. That's, I'll say, not uncommon, but it's about 50, probably in my experience, about 50-50 on whether your program will have program-specific regulations. And then the extent to which those program-specific regulations are detailed also varies widely. If there are program-specific regulations, those can then also operate to tweak what you find in the uniform guidance, but oftentimes they'll be more focused on things like what the administrative approach to the work will entail. If it's a service delivery type grant, then oftentimes there will be a lot of detail on things like beneficiary eligibility. So if your organization is providing victim or witness support, then who's eligible for that victim or witness support? That's the type of thing you're likely to see. Also further elaboration on match requirements, things of that nature. So actually not that dissimilar from, so Congress plays with those rules in the statute. The agencies will tend to play with those rules through their program specific regs, but everybody's working from that uniform guidance framework. Oh. And then below that framework, though arguably not legally binding, you should treat this stuff as legally binding. It's not law, it's guidance, but there is tons of guidance that is issued by federal agencies. The guidance also really ends up operating as a term and condition of your award. Again, arguably not binding, but you ignore it at your own peril. I would not treat it as not binding. Very different agencies have different agency-wide guidance. And then within the agency, there's often also program-specific guidance. And so examples of agency-wide guidance are those that I've described here. And by looking at this list, you can get a sense of where to look for this type of guidance. So within HHS, everyone's very familiar with something called the HHS Grants Policy Statement. It's a policy statement about this thick that further elaborates upon what the uniform guidance says. Actually, technically, it elaborates upon what the prior circular said because it still hasn't been updated since 2007. And within NIH, for example, there's the NIH Grants Policy Statement. That's updated every year, and it's a phenomenal document. But again, it further elaborates upon the uniform guidance and how to implement the uniform guidance within NIH. NSF has something that they call the PAPG, the Proposal Award and Policies and Procedures Guide. It's basic, a lot like the HHS Grants Policy Statement, but it's focused on research and it's focused on the types of research that NSF does. DoD has standard terms and conditions, but does not have otherwise a single agency-wide guidance document. But the standard terms and conditions are super duper detailed, to use a legal term. And so just reading the generally applicable terms and conditions can be really useful. DOJ has standard terms and conditions, but they're a bit ad hoc. DOJ does have the DOJ Grants Financial Guide. I tend to think that DOJ, my view is that the DOJ Grants Financial Guide really pretty much just reiterates the uniform guidance. It doesn't do much elaborating, but nonetheless, it's a useful document. And then OJP has a financial guide too. I haven't looked at that in some time, so I can't speak to its contents. And then in addition to these guidance documents that help to, if not set the terms and conditions of your award, at least explain the terms and conditions of your award, you have the notices of funding opportunity or funding opportunity announcements, depending on what the culture, what the custom is of what you call them in your particular agency. The notices of funding opportunity are really useful documents. And what I often find interesting is that my clients, they'll be talking to me about a grant and I'll say, oh, can you give me a copy of the NOFO or the FOA that led to this award? Because there's something I want to look at that I think might be in there. And they'll say, oh, we have no idea where that is. We didn't keep it. We can't find it. You should keep every notice of funding opportunity that you respond to in your grant file for as long as you're managing that grant. And then I would say some reasonable period after, because the NOFOs one of the things that will often happen, and this is, I'm going to say this with respect to another thing as well, but the agencies as a practical matter, it's just inherent human nature, won't always put out useful guidance because they're not really under the gun to put out useful guidance. They'll just leave that up to you, and then you're sort of stuck, right, trying to figure it out on your own. But when the agencies actually have to act and actually have to get the money out the door and actually want to receive compliant and useful grant applications, well, they're now in a position where they really do have to provide some guidance, and they really do have to provide some guidance on some of the gray areas in their program. Is X, Y, or Z cost allowable given what the statute says in our program? And at that moment, when they're under the gun to do that, that's when they do it, and they'll do it in that notice of funding opportunity. So that can be a really useful interpretive guide as well. So it's important to hang on to it. And then the grant application instructions. So one of the things that I find often to be the case is when I can't find an answer to an ambiguous gray area type question on how a particular agency treats a particular cost, that if I go back and read the application instructions, and in particular read the application instructions for the budget submission and the budget narrative submission, that's where the agency will finally explain how it views application of that particular requirement. So, for example, treatment of administrative cost caps, agencies vary greatly on how they're treated. They won't always issue regulations explaining that. But if I go and if maybe I'm looking at, well, does this agency consider administrative costs to be only indirect costs, or does this agency consider administrative costs to be defined more broadly as including things beyond just costs that are recovered through an indirect cost rate agreement? It's impossible to guess at what that answer is going to be because different agencies treat it differently. And if they don't have regulations that answer the question, if they don't have a specific guidance document that answers the question, you're going to be in a bind because it's an important question. You have to manage it, and they've never answered it. Well, where they probably have, and where they've answered it is most likely it will be addressed in the application instructions on the budget section for the grant application. So this really links that application process to the performance of the award, and it's important to retain that information. So how do you figure all this out? So those are your resources. The way that I will typically approach a new grant program when I'm trying to understand, well, what happened here? What is it that Congress did? Is I'll use sam.gov, the OMB compliance supplement, the agency website, and I do all of this against what I think it's fair to say is a pretty strong background on what is in 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance, in particular, the administrative requirements and the cost principles. I will also, if I have access to it, look at the NOFO and the application instructions. But I want to walk you through an example really quickly with the last couple of minutes that we have together. So this is UCJJ, right? Department of Justice funding. Colette shared with me that the Burn JAG program is, in fact, one of the major programs that has funding that is passed down to subrecipients. So it's one with which many of you will be familiar. If we were, I'm going to do something very dangerous here. I'm going to try to share my screen to share my Windows Explorer. Let me see if I can do that. So Colette, I'm going to probably take away your screen share, and then you'll have to take it back from me in a moment. All right. If Colette, if you could give me a thumbs up, do you see the Burn JAG program in the background here? Anyone?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, thank you. So when I talk about these resources, I feel like sometimes a picture or a tour can be worth 1,000 words. One of the best places that you can start in trying to understand the terms and conditions that apply to any funding stream, this is not just DOJ funding streams, is to start with sam.gov. And sam.gov used to have, so there used to be something called the CFDA, the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. The CFDA technically actually was an OMB circular, but it was electronic, it was online. So you go to the CFDA website. That's been rolled into sam.gov, and they've taken away, because the government can't help itself but move the chairs around. The term CFDA is now gone. We now call them assistance listings, still all the same stuff. So every single grant program, just like it has an authorizing act, has an assistance listing in sam.gov, and every single one of them has a number. It used to be called the CFDA number. Now it's called the assistance listing number. Very easy to simply Google, for example, burn JAG program CFDA. And one of the search results that comes up will be the 5-digit CFDA number or assistance listing number now. You can go to sam.gov and plug that in and very quickly get an overview of the program. And again, I'm a lawyer. I mean, I read the statutes, I read the regulations, we analyze them, we litigate them. But when I'm trying to get the lay of the land, I go to sam.gov because it is the quickest way to get started and get a sense of the full lay of the land. So in this case, I just searched, I found the CFDA number through Google or Bing or whatever your preferred search engine. And then I just went into sam.gov, pulled up 16738, which is your assistance listing number for the burn JAG program. And there's a treasure trove of high-level information here. So for example, authorization, let's scroll down. This tells you, okay, this is where you can go find the statute that created the program. And it even sort of pin sites you really specifically to the sections of the broader statute that talk about the grant program. Okay, that's very useful. Right now I know where to go and read to understand what the statute says. Types of assistance. Okay, now know this is a formula grant and then also project grants are available. Applicant eligibility. Who's eligible for the funding? So does it make sense, right? That I am in fact a part of this system. Use of assistance. Oftentimes, even in sam.gov, there will be a discussion of limitations on, well, first, there'll be a statement of the general purpose of use of the assistance, and then oftentimes a statement of limitations on use of the assistance. This is not your legal authority. This isn't what you want to rely on, but you're getting the lay of the land. We're going to go to more reliable documents in a minute. Compliance requirements. This is a great section. For anyone who's super excited about reading about compliance requirements, right? What parts of the uniform guidance apply, right? Burn JAG, all of them. There are plenty of programs where there are certain components of the UG that don't apply. And then oftentimes, though this section's not as reliable, regulations, guidance, and literature, oftentimes if the program has regulations, they'll be referenced, the programmatic regulations will be referenced in this section. So this is a great starting point. But then where I'd like to go next, and I'm going to stop, well, the OMB compliance supplement. So this is a guide that's put out every year for auditors. Most of the major grant programs are addressed. You can search it by CFDA number and actually get a write-up. Now this is from OMB on what the agency, because this is all submitted to OMB by the agency, so in this case, Department of Justice, what they consider to be the core programmatic requirements and compliance requirements, and actually get a description of how they treat them. A great example here is your prohibited uses of the burn JAG program. It tells you right where to go in the statute to find that list of prohibited uses. And then here you've got a cross link to the website of the agency that then provides you with additional guidance. And that's the last tool, is the agency websites tend to be very good. They usually have a resources tab that's very helpful. I was going to go a little bit more in depth on being able to then drill down into what are actually FAQs in the program that are linked from the website. And those FAQs explaining from the statute and then into the FAQs how administrative cost caps are measured in the burn JAG program. It's not because you need to know that at the end of this meeting, but it's a great example of how do you quickly drill down to the answer to an esoteric question and how it operates in this particular agency on this particular grant. So with that, I know we're coming up to the end. I will stop my share, and Colette, if you want to bring the presentation back up, I'm happy to take questions and to turn back over to you. But that's your terms and conditions in a nutshell, how you figure out all of this stuff that feels at first insurmountable. It's not. I mean, it's like eating an elephant one bite at a time, but these are your tools. So Colette, it's all yours.
I'm just going to interject in there. So when I can't remember if it was NHS or NIH that you mentioned, Scott, that said has the cap on salary. The DOJ financial guide also has that same requirement. So before all of our grantees think they can go give themselves a major raise this year, no, you cannot. There is that same cap. It is on page 70. I went and looked it up just so you know.
Wonderful. It must be a different statutory basis, but I did not know that, and I'm glad you clarified.
Yeah, so don't everybody give themselves a huge raise this year. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining us. I told you you were going to be in good hands with Jordan, Morgan, Brett, and Scott. So thank you to our presenters, especially for giving us this information. I know this is a lot of information. I'm going to drop a link to a survey. It's a feedback survey. It'll take you maybe 30 seconds to fill out because they're super quick questions. But if you would do that for us, I would appreciate that. Again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. And thanks for Livy for being our behind the scenes person today. And everybody, I hope you have a great day.